May 10, 1945. A small road outside the village of Zell am See in the Austrian Alps. The grass is wet from a recent rain. A column of American jeeps idles in the morning light, the engines ticking softly in the cool air. Standing beside the lead vehicle is a German officer in a long greatcoat, 56 years old, his face lined with exhaustion. He has just handed over his pistol. He has just become a prisoner. His name is Heinz Wilhelm Guderian. He is the man who, more than almost any other living soldier, shaped how the world thought about tanks in war. He wrote the book that armoured officers in 7 countries had been studying for almost a decade. He led the panzer columns that broke France in 6 weeks. He was one of the principal architects of the war of movement that the Germans called Bewegungskrieg, and that the rest of the world, watching the newsreels in horrified disbelief, would simply call Blitzkrieg. A young American captain steps forward to take down his name. Guderian gives it. The captain writes it carefully in a notebook. None of the Americans on that road quite understand who they have just captured. They will figure it out within hours, and a chain of phone calls will travel up through 7th Army intelligence to Eisenhower's headquarters, and within days, a series of interrogators will be sent to question him about everything he knows. They will ask him about the Polish campaign. They will ask him about the Ardennes breakthrough in 1940. They will ask him about the long retreat from Moscow. And at some point in the months of interrogation that follow, an American officer will ask Guderian a question he was not entirely expecting. The officer will ask him what he thinks of an American general named George S. Patton. Guderian pauses. His answer is one no one in the room expects. He says he has heard much about Patton. He calls the campaign a good one. And then, in a single sentence, he gives away something no defeated commander in his position should ever willingly concede. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, he tells them, "I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." That sentence is one of the strangest admissions ever made by a defeated commander about the man who beat him. It is also, when you understand what it actually meant in the mouth of the man who said it, an answer to a question that had been hanging over the entire Western campaign of 1944 and 1945. The question was whether the Americans had a real armoured doctrine, or whether they were just throwing weight at the problem until something broke. Guderian's answer, given quietly in a room with the recorder running, was the most damaging thing he could possibly have said for his own side. He said the Americans had understood. He said one of them, at least, had understood the way he himself understood. The man who had understood was George Patton. To grasp why that single sentence carried so much weight, we have to go back to a young German staff officer in France in the autumn of 1917, attached to the operations work of an army headquarters along the Western Front, who was watching the war that had been killing his generation for 3 years and was beginning to see something nobody else in his army had quite seen yet. The young man was Heinz Guderian. He was 29 years old. He had spent most of the First World War as a signals and staff officer, never in command of troops in combat, but always in a position to see the wider picture. By the autumn of 1917, what he had been seeing was the bankruptcy of the war he had grown up believing in. The German army had been built around the rapid offensive campaign. The plan that opened the war in 1914, the famous Schlieffen Plan, had assumed that armies could move at the pace of marching infantry and the speed of horse-drawn artillery, sweep across northern France, and end the war in 6 weeks. By the end of 1914, the plan had collapsed into stalemate. By 1917, 3 years of trench warfare had eaten an entire generation of European men. Guderian, watching from the operations staff of an army that no longer knew how to move, drew a conclusion almost no one else around him was drawing. The problem was not the plan. The problem was that the technology to make the plan work had not existed in 1914, and was only just beginning to exist now. The technology was the internal combustion engine. When Guderian later read the reports of the British tank attack at Cambrai in November of 1917, 476 tanks rolling through the German lines in the first true mass-armoured attack of the war, he saw something the British High Command did not yet quite understand, and the German High Command was certain was a freak. He saw the future. The British, having broken the line, lacked the doctrine to exploit the breakthrough, and the attack stalled. The Germans counterattacked and recovered most of the lost ground within 10 days. Most observers concluded that tanks were a curiosity. Guderian concluded that tanks, properly used, would change everything. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany to possess tanks. The German army that emerged from the wreckage was limited to 100,000 men with no armoured vehicles, no military aircraft, and no general staff. For most German officers, this was a humiliation to be endured. For a small group of thinkers within the Reichswehr, it was an opportunity. With nothing to defend, no large standing units to maintain, and no entrenched bureaucracy to protect, they could rethink everything from the ground up. Guderian threw himself into the rethinking. He read voraciously. He wrote articles. He argued with skeptics in lecture halls and in the pages of military journals. He built improvised training models out of cardboard and bicycles and trucks because there were no real tanks to train with. He studied British military theorists, particularly J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, whose writings on mobile warfare were being largely ignored in their own country. He absorbed everything he could find about the Soviet theorist Tukhachevsky, whose concept of deep battle was developing along similar lines and who would eventually be murdered by Stalin for being too brilliant. Out of all of this, he began to synthesize something distinctly his own. He was not the only German officer working on these ideas. Oswald Lutz, his immediate superior in the Inspectorate of Motorized Troops, had been advocating for a mobile arm before Guderian even joined the office. Erich von Manstein would soon contribute the doctrine of independent assault gun units. Erwin Rommel, in the late 1930s, would emerge as another voice. But Guderian was the one who put the vision into a popular book. In 1937, with the rebuilding of the Wehrmacht well underway and the first 3 panzer divisions already in existence, he published Achtung Panzer. The title meant Attention Tank, or in a more colloquial English, Beware the Tank. The book set out a doctrine that was at once simple and revolutionary. Tanks must be concentrated, not parcelled out among infantry units. They must be used in mass, on narrow fronts, against weak points. They must be supported by motorized infantry, by artillery that could keep up, and above all by close ground attack aviation. They must drive deep into the enemy rear before he could reorganize. The pace of the attack, the relentlessness of it, was itself a weapon. When the war came in 1939, Guderian was given the chance to prove the theory on living men. In Poland, his 19th Corps drove south through the corridor in just over 2 weeks, fighting its way through to Brest-Litovsk by mid-September. In France, in May of 1940, he commanded the breakthrough at Sedan, drove west across northern France against the explicit nervousness of his own superiors, and reached the English Channel at Abbeville in 7 days, cutting off the entire British expeditionary force and the best French armies in a pocket they could not escape from. The French campaign had been expected by both sides to last at least a year. It lasted 6 weeks. For the next 18 months, Guderian was one of the most successful operational commanders in the most successful army in the world. His panzer group plunged into the Soviet Union in June of 1941 and helped close the Białystok-Minsk pocket in the first days, taking part in an encirclement that produced something on the order of 300,000 prisoners. He helped close the Kiev pocket in September with what is widely regarded as the largest single battle of encirclement in the history of warfare, capturing more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers. By late November, he was driving on Moscow from the south, his lead elements at the city of Tula, roughly 100 miles from the Soviet capital, when the Russian winter and a Russian counterattack and the increasingly erratic decisions of his own Führer combined to stop him cold. In December of 1941, after withdrawing units to a defensible line in defiance of Hitler's standfast order, Guderian was relieved of command for the first time. He would be relieved a second time in March of 1945, after a long shouting match in the Reich Chancellery. Between those 2 firings, in March of 1943, after the disaster at Stalingrad, he was recalled to a desk job as Inspector General of Armoured Troops. From that office he watched, increasingly powerless, as the army he had helped build was ground down on 3 fronts at once. This was the man who, in the spring and summer of 1945, sat in a room with American interrogators and was asked about George Patton. He had reason to be bitter. His country was destroyed. His son had been wounded twice in France in 1940. His estate at Diepenhof, a Polish property given to him by Hitler in 1942 from confiscated land, had been overrun by the Red Army. The doctrine he had spent his life refining had failed to deliver final victory. And yet, when the question came, he gave the answer he gave. He paid the compliment. To understand why, we have to look at what Patton had actually been doing in the months that Guderian was watching from a distance, increasingly cut off from the front, increasingly aware that the men opposite him were now using something that looked uncomfortably familiar. The story moves now to a stretch of road in northern France in late July of 1944. Operation Cobra had just broken the German line in Normandy. The 3rd United States Army, under the command of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, was activated on August 1. Patton, who had been kept on the sidelines for months as a deception asset, was finally given an army to command. Within 24 hours of his troops crossing into open country, the war in the West became a different war. For the next 30 days, Patton's Third Army moved at a speed that no American formation had ever moved at, and that very few formations in any army had ever moved at. They covered roughly 400 miles in 4 weeks. They liberated cities at a pace that outran the supply trucks. They captured, in some single-day operations, more ground than the entire Allied force had taken in the first 6 weeks after D-Day. They reached the Moselle River by the first week of September, and would have crossed the Rhine before the leaves fell if their fuel had not run out. The German officers on the receiving end of this were, in many cases, men who had themselves served under Guderian or alongside him. They had been the practitioners of Blitzkrieg in 1940. They knew what an aggressive armoured thrust looked like because they had executed them. In August and September of 1944, they were watching something that looked almost exactly like what they themselves had done to the French 4 years earlier, except that the French were now them. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, told American interrogators after the war that Patton was speedy in the advance. General Günther Blumentritt, who had helped plan the original invasions of Poland and France, said his side regarded Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action, whose operations impressed the Germans enormously, probably because he came closest to their own concept of the classical military commander. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had commanded German forces in Italy, said in his post-war writings that Patton, like Rommel, had an instinct for armoured warfare that he simply had not seen in many of the other Allied generals. These were not casual compliments. They were professional assessments by men who had spent their careers fighting at the highest level of mobile operations. They amounted, in the language of soldiers, to the recognition that a member of the other side had figured out something you yourself had spent your life mastering. The most striking of those assessments came from Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, who had served as Hitler's chief of operations from 1940 until the end of the war, and who would be hanged at Nuremberg the following year. Jodl told his interrogators, in his exact words, that Patton was the American Guderian. He was very bold, Jodl said, and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. Think about the weight of that phrase, the American Guderian. The man Jodl was naming as a reference point was the one whose campaign in France in 1940 had set the standard against which every armoured commander would be measured for the rest of the 20th century. To call Patton the American Guderian was not flattery. It was the highest professional recognition a German officer could give, and it was being given to a foreign commander who had just, with a force largely composed of newly trained citizen soldiers, beaten the very army Guderian had helped build. Here is where the story becomes more complicated than the popular legend suggests. The popular legend, fed largely by the 1970 film starring George C.A. Scott, holds that the Germans were terrified of Patton, that they tracked his every move, that they considered him the most dangerous Allied commander on the field. The historian Harry Yeide, whose 2011 book Fighting Patton went through the surviving German military records to find every reference to Patton he could locate, demonstrated that this is not really true. Patton appears less prominently in those records than Bradley or Montgomery. The German High Command, busy trying to stop the Allies on a 1,000-mile front, was not following his comings and goings like spectators at a tennis match. What was true, and what Yeide carefully reconstructed was something more interesting. The Germans recognized Patton, when he became visible to them, as a particular type of commander. They recognized him as one of their own, philosophically speaking. They recognized him because he was using their methods. The recognition of one professional by another, even across the lines of a war that had killed tens of millions of people, is one of the strange, persistent currents in the literature of armored warfare. This is the part of the story I want to make sure we get right, because if we get it wrong, we end up flattering Patton in a way he himself would probably have rejected. Patton was not, despite his admirers, a strategist on the level of Manstein or Montgomery. The Germans never viewed him as the architect of Allied grand strategy. He was something narrower, and in the right circumstances, more dangerous. He was a tactician of armored exploitation. He understood, in his bones, what to do once a hole had been opened in the enemy line. And what he understood was almost identical to what Guderian had been teaching for 15 years. The next question is how Patton came to understand it. He did not, despite the famous line from the movie, read Guderian's book. Achtung Panzer was not translated into English until 1992, almost half a century after Patton's death. Whatever Patton learned, he did not learn from that source text. But Patton was an obsessive student of warfare. He read in French and could puzzle through technical German with a dictionary. He read everything he could get his hands on about the campaigns he expected to fight. In the early 1930s, while most American officers were ignoring Europe, Patton was already absorbing what the German theorists were producing, including the writings of Hans von Seeckt, the post-war architect of the Reichswehr, and Ernst Junger's wartime memoir, Storm of Steel, which had been available in English since 1929. He read Erwin Rommel's 1937 book Infantry Attacks, a study of small unit tactics in the First World War, and absorbed Rommel's emphasis on speed, surprise, and deep penetration. He read Liddell Hart on the indirect approach. He read everything that came out of Germany about the Polish and French campaigns as soon as it could be translated, and he watched the newsreels of the German panzers rolling through Sedan with the eye of a man who understood what he was seeing. He had also been there at the beginning. In 1917 and 1918, as a young captain, Patton had organized and commanded the first American tank school in France. He led the first American tank attack in history at Saint-Mihiel in September of 1918. He was wounded in action commanding tanks at the Meuse-Argonne later that month. Between the wars, when the American army had largely abandoned armor, Patton quietly kept the faith, writing articles, building models, advocating for a tank doctrine that nobody in Washington wanted to hear. By the time the war came, Patton had spent more than 20 years thinking about how tanks should be used. The conclusions he had reached were so close to Guderian's that they could almost have been written by the same man. "Never tell people how to do things," Patton wrote. "Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity." The Germans had a name for that idea. They called it Auftragstaktik, mission tactics. It was the spine of the doctrine that made the Wehrmacht what it was. Patton had arrived at it independently, by reading and by thinking, and by remembering his own experience in command. Rommel himself, recovering from wounds in the summer of 1944, wrote admiring assessments of several Allied commanders. He distinguished between Montgomery, whom he considered a strategist and a multidimensional commander, and Patton, whom he saw as something different, a man whose talent expressed itself most clearly in mobile warfare. Rommel knew what he was looking at. He had spent years doing the same thing in the desert. Patton's mastery showed up most clearly in what he did once a position had been broken. The first 6 weeks of the Allied campaign in 1944, the long Battle of Normandy from June through July, were a slogging match in terrain that did not favour armour. The Bocage country was a tank commander's nightmare. But the moment Allied forces broke into the open, on July 25 with Operation Cobra, Patton did something very few commanders in the war did. He climbed into an armoured car and rode forward to where the decisions were actually being made. He led from the front. He kept his subordinates moving when they were exhausted. He insisted on aggression when caution would have been easier, and he made decisions in hours that other Allied commanders made in days. In August of 1944, his Third Army cleared Brittany in a week. They closed the Falaise pocket from the south, helping to trap and destroy what remained of two German armies. Estimates of German losses inside the pocket vary across the historiography, but somewhere around 50,000 prisoners were taken, and at least 10,000 killed in less than a fortnight, with a further large but disputed number escaping eastward across the Seine. Patton's southern arm of the trap moved with such speed that the American commanders to his north, including Bradley, were repeatedly slowing him down out of fear that he would outrun his support and create gaps in the line. Patton, for his part, kept asking permission to drive further. He believed, and several historians have since agreed, that if he had been allowed to close the gap completely, the German 7th Army would have been destroyed in place rather than allowed to escape across the river. What followed was the dash itself. They drove east across France faster than the German rear could withdraw. They liberated Reims on August 30th. They reached the Marne. They captured intact bridges that the Germans had not had time to demolish. By the end of August, Patton's tanks were in Verdun, more than 340 miles from where they had started a month earlier, and his lead reconnaissance elements were probing across the Meuse. The pace ran into the same problem every long armoured advance runs into. The supply trucks could not keep up. The Red Ball Express, the famous American truck convoy operation hauling fuel and ammunition forward from the Normandy beaches, was running 24 hours a day on roads that had not been built for it, and even that was not enough. The fuel ran out before the German army did. On the last day of August, with his armoured columns sitting motionless in fields outside Verdun for lack of gasoline, Patton wrote in his diary that he could be at the Rhine in 3 days if he had the fuel for it. He did not have the fuel. The fuel was going north, to Montgomery, for an operation that would eventually fail at Arnhem. The argument over that decision has occupied historians ever since, and there is no clean answer to it. What is not in dispute is that Patton's exhausted columns, sitting with empty tanks in late August of 1944, were closer to ending the war that autumn than any Allied force would be again until the following spring. The Germans, watching this from the other side of the line, kept reaching for the same comparison. "He fights like one of us," they kept saying. "He moves the way Guderian taught us to move." In the end, the man whose name they were reaching for would be the one to close the loop. The next question is the harder one. Why could the man who had built this kind of warfare not, in 1944, do what Patton was doing? The answer is one of the bleakest stories in the history of military command, and it has very little to do with the Americans, and almost everything to do with what had happened inside the German army by the time the Western Allies came ashore. Guderian's doctrine, when he developed it in the 1930s, required certain things to work. It required tanks in sufficient numbers, with reliable engines and good radios. It required experienced crews. It required an officer corps trained to make independent decisions on the move. It required air superiority, or at least air parity, to keep the columns from being bombed in the open. Above all, it required the political trust that allowed a commander on the spot to act on his own judgment without waiting for orders that would arrive too late to matter. By 1944, the German army had lost almost every one of these conditions. The Eastern Front had ground up the experienced panzer crews. Of the men who had crossed the Polish border in 1939, very few were still alive and uninjured 5 years later. The replacements were older men or boys, hastily trained, sent forward with equipment that no longer reliably worked. Tank production had increased in absolute numbers, thanks to the brutal efficiency of Albert Speer's reorganization of German industry, but the new tanks were heavier, more complicated, more prone to mechanical failure, and harder to keep fueled. The Tiger and the Panther were beautiful machines on paper and nightmares of unreliability in the field. Air superiority had completely vanished by 1944. From the moment Patton's columns began moving in early August, they were screened from above by waves of American fighter bombers. Any German armoured counterattack that moved during daylight was a target. The famous German Panzer Division could no longer behave like a panzer division because it could not survive in the open. It moved at night, hid in tree lines during the day, and fought, when it fought, at a fraction of its theoretical capacity. Worst of all was the political problem. Guderian's doctrine required trust between the high command and the field commander. Hitler, by 1944, had spent 5 years systematically eliminating that trust. He had relieved Guderian himself in 1941 for retreating to a defensible line. He had relieved Manstein in March of 1944, on the eve of the campaigns where Manstein's particular gift would have mattered most. He had refused to allow Rommel any flexibility before D-Day, parceling out the panzer reserves under his personal control and refusing to release them until it was too late. He had sent direct orders to division commanders, bypassing Army Group headquarters, ordering positions held that could not be held, demanding counterattacks by units that no longer existed on the maps in his bunker. A German divisional commander in the summer of 1944 could not act the way Guderian had acted in the summer of 1940, because the price of being wrong, or even of being right but unable to prove it, was now removal, dishonor, or worse. The very flexibility that had made the Wehrmacht so dangerous in the first half of the war had been beaten out of it by its own leader. Patton was operating on the other side of this. Eisenhower, whatever his faults, was not Hitler. He gave his army commanders the latitude to act. Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, was a steadier man, and at times a less imaginative one, but he understood when to let Patton run. The result was that Patton, in the late summer of 1944, was doing something the Germans had structurally lost the ability to do. He was making decisions at the operational level, in real time, with the trust of his superiors, against an enemy whose commanders were hamstrung by their own political system. There is a single moment that captures all of this. On December 19, 1944, 3 days after the German Ardennes offensive had broken through the thin American line in the Belgian forests, Eisenhower called a conference of his senior commanders in the city of Verdun. The room was on the second floor of an old French stone barracks, warmed inadequately by a single potbelly stove, with situation maps propped on easels along one wall. Bradley was there. So was Devers, commanding the 6th Army Group to the south. Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy, sat in for the British. The maps showed the German salient driving deeper into Belgium by the hour. The American First Army was being driven back. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in the southern Ardennes, was about to be surrounded. Eisenhower asked Patton how soon he could swing his Third Army 90 degrees from its current eastward attack, drive north into the German flank, and relieve Bastogne. Patton answered that he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went quiet. The Allied generals around the table did not believe him. Bradley, who knew Patton best, told him to give himself some leeway. The maneuver Patton was proposing involved disengaging from a battle in progress, rotating an entire army a quarter turn in the worst winter in 50 years, moving over 100 miles on icy roads, and attacking a fortified enemy flank. It was, in the words of one staff officer present, the kind of thing that would have gotten you reprimanded at a staff college if you had proposed it as an exercise. What Patton did not tell the room, because there was no time and no need, was that he had already given the order. A week earlier, suspecting the Germans might be planning something in the Ardennes when most American intelligence officers were dismissing the possibility, he had ordered his staff to begin contingency planning for exactly this maneuver. By the time he sat down at Verdun, his operations officer was already moving units into position. When Patton left the meeting, he made a single phone call to his headquarters with a pre-arranged code phrase, "Play ball." The Third Army was already on the road. 3 Third Army divisions attacked north in the middle of a snowstorm on December 22. They smashed into the German southern flank along a 20-mile front. They drove the Germans back 7 miles in the first day. The lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division, specifically the 37th Tank Battalion, under a young lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, who would one day be Chief of Staff of the United States Army, broke through to the perimeter of Bastogne on the afternoon of December 26. The first tank into the perimeter was a Sherman named Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess. The siege was lifted. The German offensive was broken. More than 133,000 vehicles had been moved. Tens of thousands of men had been redirected. An entire army had been rotated through 90 degrees in winter conditions, in less than a week, against a determined enemy. The maneuver remains, by most operational measures, the largest pivot of an army of that size ever attempted under fire. In the technical sense, it was exactly the kind of operation Guderian had spent his career advocating, and it had been executed by an American. When Guderian, sitting in an Allied interrogation room some months later, was asked what he thought of Patton, he was being asked to assess the man who had executed a Guderian campaign with a non-Guderian army against a German army that had lost the ability to be Guderian's army anymore. He gave his answer honestly. He said Patton had acted as he himself would have acted. He gave the highest professional acknowledgement one soldier can give another. In doing so, he was admitting something larger and more painful. The doctrine he had built had, in its essential elements, been carried forward by the enemy, and the enemy had used it to destroy the army he had built it for. The setting for that admission was itself one of the stranger archives to come out of the entire war. When the Germans surrendered in May of 1945, the Allies suddenly held nearly the entire surviving senior officer corps of the Wehrmacht. Some of these men were marked for trial as war criminals. Others were considered political problems to be managed. Still others were treated as a kind of professional resource, debriefed exhaustively about their operational experience for what would become the most extensive set of after-action reports ever produced about a defeated enemy. The American program was run by the United States Army Historical Division. From 1945 through the late 1940s, Allied historians and intelligence officers conducted thousands of hours of interviews with German generals, asking them not just what they had done, but why they had done it, and what they had thought of their adversaries. Guderian himself was an active participant. After his release from prisoner of war status in 1948, he continued to consult for the historical program, contributing studies on armoured operations on the Eastern Front and on the Western campaigns he had not personally fought in but had observed closely. The strangeness of the arrangement is worth pausing on. The senior officers of an army that had killed millions of people were now, in well-heated rooms in Bavaria and Hesse, sitting across tables from American captains and majors, and explaining, sometimes patiently and sometimes irritably, how they had done what they had done. Some of them dictated their answers. Others wrote out long manuscripts in their own hand. The studies, eventually catalogued by the Office of the Chief of Military History as the Foreign Military Studies series, run to thousands of separate documents. They are housed today in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, and remain one of the most important primary sources we have for the inner working of the German command during the war. What is striking, when you read through the surviving transcripts, is that the German generals being interviewed were not mainly bitter. They were tired. Many had lost sons, many had lost everything. But they were professional soldiers, and they engaged with the historical questions as professional soldiers do. They argued about who had made the right decision at which crossroads, set out their reasoning, and acknowledged, when honesty required it, the merits of the men who had beaten them. The pattern that emerges in those records, when the subject of Patton comes up, is consistent. The generals did not particularly fear him in the field, in the way the popular legend suggests. They considered him a particular kind of commander, useful in particular circumstances, vulnerable in others. Hasso von Manteuffel, who had commanded German armoured forces against Patton in the Ardennes, said Patton had failed to exploit his breakthrough at Lorraine in the autumn of 1944 with the same boldness he had shown in August. Fritz Bayerlein, who had served with Rommel in the desert and had commanded Panzer in Normandy, said that in the beginning of the French campaign he had thought Patton was the best of the American generals, but that Patton's later operations seemed to him less impressive. Read together, the German assessments are nuanced. They are not hagiography, but on the central professional point, they were unanimous. Patton understood armoured warfare in a way that very few Allied generals did. He understood it the way the Germans themselves understood it. The man whose understanding had defined the standard was Guderian, and Guderian's own assessment, when it finally came, did the one thing the others did not. He went the last step. He did not say merely that Patton had fought like one of them. He said Patton had fought as he himself would have fought. The personal pronoun is doing real work in that sentence. It is the difference between recognizing a colleague and recognizing a self. There is one more piece of context that makes the admission heavier than it first appears. By the time Guderian gave it, Patton was dead. George Patton died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a low-speed automobile accident outside Mannheim, Germany. He was 60 years old. He had survived 4 years of war, leading from the front through North Africa, Sicily, France, Belgium, and Germany, only to be paralyzed in a stationary car that was struck at slow speed by a turning truck. His neck was broken at the fourth cervical vertebra. He lingered for almost 2 weeks in the hospital in Heidelberg before a pulmonary embolism took him. He was buried in the American military cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg, among the men of his Third Army. Guderian was alive. He was in American custody. He had survived his army, his country, his cause, and the man who had ridden his own doctrine into Bastogne. In a sense, he was speaking about a dead colleague. The Germans, with their long tradition of professional regard for the enemy, had a phrase for this kind of acknowledgement. They called it Ritterlichkeit, chivalry. But more specifically, the chivalry that recognizes equal skill across the lines. The verdict, as we approach it, is in some ways simpler than the long story that produced it. The legend says Guderian admired Patton because Patton was a great general. That is true, but it is not the whole truth. The deeper reading is that Guderian recognized in Patton not greatness in the abstract, but a specific kind of practitioner of a specific kind of warfare, the kind he himself had spent his life building. When he said Patton acted as he would have acted, he was saying that Patton had inherited the doctrine in its essentials, even if not from the original texts, and had executed it more successfully in the late Western campaign than the Germans themselves had been able to. That is the admission of defeat folded inside the compliment. The doctrine of mobile warfare at speed had not failed. It had simply, in the end, been better executed by the Americans, with their fuel supplies that did not run out, their air cover that did not vanish, their command structure that allowed initiative, and their generals who were trusted to act. The Germans had built the system. They had not been able to keep using it. The Americans had picked it up, carried it through France, and finished the job. There is one more thing that has to be said, because the historical record on Guderian is not flattering, and any honest assessment has to include it. He was not a clean figure. As Inspector General of Armoured Troops in 1943, and as Acting Chief of the Army General Staff after the July 20th plot in 1944, he served Hitler closely. He sat on the Court of Honor that expelled officers suspected of involvement in the assassination attempt, sending them out of the army so they could be tried by the People's Court and hanged. His own panzer group on the Eastern Front in 1941 had implemented the Criminal Commissar Order, under which captured Soviet political officers were executed without trial. The Polish estate at Diepenhof was not earned. It was given to him by Hitler in 1942, taken from a country that the German army had broken 3 years earlier. His memoirs, published in 1950 as Erinnerungen eines Soldaten and translated as Panzer Leader, presented a version of his career that subsequent scholarship has substantially revised. He is not the man the post-war legend made him. But on the specific question of military judgment, his testimony about Patton was not self-serving. He had nothing to gain by praising a dead American general. The compliment cost him nothing politically and gained him nothing professionally. As best the record allows us to tell, it was simply what he thought. What he thought was that the Americans had won because, somewhere in the wide ranks of their officer corps, they had produced at least one man who understood the war the way the Germans understood it, and who had executed it at a moment when the Germans no longer could. That man was George Patton. What remains is the part this story leaves you with, which is not really about Patton and not really about Guderian. A doctrine, when it is good enough, eventually escapes the men who built it. They cannot keep it for themselves. It travels by translation, by observation, by the slow, patient work of professionals reading each other's writing across the lines of war. It changes hands. It ends up sometimes in the possession of the very people the original builders thought were incapable of using it, and then it is used against them. Guderian, when he was asked, told the truth. He said Patton acted as he would have acted. It was the most generous thing he could have said about an enemy. It was also the most damaging thing he could have said about his own side. If you have made it this far, thank you for spending the time. The men in this story, on both sides, are gone. The questions they fought over have not gone away, because they were never really questions about tanks. They were questions about how a free society organizes itself for war, how trust between leaders and the led is built or broken, and what survives when an idea outlives the army that first carried it. If your father or grandfather served in the Third Army, or in any of the units that followed Patton across France and Belgium and into Germany, and you carry their story, I would be honored to read about them in the comments. The official histories preserve a certain kind of record. The names of the men who actually did the fighting are preserved by the families who carry them forward. That record matters too. A like on this video is a small thing, but it helps stories like this reach the people who care about getting the history right. Subscribe if you would like the next one. There are more stories like this one, and the men who fought this war on every side deserve to be remembered as they actually were, in the full complication of what they did and what they understood.